In the twilight years of British steam traction, some of the most radical and efficient engine designs would come to the fore, with perhaps the most formidable being the BR Standard 9F, one of the final steam locomotive classes to be developed in the UK, though despite the increasingly tight budget on which BR could create such engines, the 9F proved to be strong, capable machines that were a perfect send-off for steam traction in mainline operation. Prior to the 9Fs, the concept of steam locomotives with 10 coupled wheels were very rare on the British railway network, with the only designs of note being the Midland Railway's 010 Licky Banker, also known as Big Bertha, and the Great Eastern's ultimately fruitless 010 Decapod tank engine, which was an experimental locomotive for heavy suburban trains. The only type to reach volume production was a government design of a 210 produced during the Second World War, that being the Austerity 210 as designed by Robert Riddles, and was derived from the original Austerity 280 but featured a longer boiler, the 210 presenting approximately the same power as the smaller engine, but through its extra wheels was able to enjoy a lower axle load, thereby affording it a higher route availability. This design brought into focus the advantages that could be obtained by using a 10-coupled wheel arrangement, which produced a very sure-footed locomotive, while having the added benefit of a leading pony truck that could assist in steering the engine and reducing track wear. Following the nationalisation of the railways in 1948, the British Railways Board decided to introduce a range of standard steam engines which were suitable for use in all areas of the country, with comparative tests being carried out known as the 1948 Exchange Trials, which involved the best designs from the former Big Four railways, as a way of determining the optimal facets of each locomotive type prior to work on the new range of engines beginning. It was hoped that the introduction of these new designs would bring savings in maintenance and training costs, as well as providing locomotives with a large number of interchangeable parts, with many of them, particularly the mixed traffic designs, being closely based on LMS practice, while the first proposals did not include a heavy freight engine. In 1950, the design team working on the standards proposed that a future heavy freight engine should have a 282 wheel arrangement, noting the success of such a configuration in the United States, and its ability to support a wide firebox, though this idea was soon countermanded by Robert Riddles, BR's chief mechanical engineer, who argued in favour of a 210 layout based on his prior experience and success with the WD Austerity locomotives. Riddles was adamant that it was possible to fit a wide enough firebox to a locomotive with driving wheels at the rear, provided that the wheel diameter did not exceed 5 foot, with the wide firebox providing the required boiler capacity without resorting to a rear pony truck. Approval for the new 210 was given in 1951, with responsibility for its design being passed to the drawing office in Brighton, the experience gained on existing standards resulting in plain coupling rods being specified instead of the fluted type originally fitted to the Class 7 Britannia Pacifics, while plans to fit the engines with roller bearings were abandoned. The frames of the locomotive would be close together to provide additional strength, while a flangeless center driving wheel would be used to assist the engine in going around curves, the cab and footplate, as per the other BR standards, being suspended from the boiler rather than the frames, while the boiler itself was mounted as high as the loading gauge would allow. Steeply inclined cylinders were necessary for clearance purposes, and these drove wheels, which were balanced to reduce hammer blow on the track and to assist with smooth running at speed. The initial batch of 39Fs were completed in 1954 at Crewe Works, by which time more than 300 standard locomotives had been built, thus meaning the assembly teams were well versed in their construction, the first 8 units being sent to Newport, South Wales, with many of the following engines being allocated to the London Midland region for use on long-distance coal trains from the Midlands into London. As more of the class was built, their influence spread to the eastern region, where they were used on coal trains, in this case from the area around Peterborough, while another batch was sent to work the Birkenhead-Shotton iron ore trains. Introduction into service was surprisingly trouble-free, with the only issues of note being problems with the regulator and the steam brakes, which caused some overruns and minor collisions in the early days, the 9Fs proving themselves to be capable of carrying out a very high workload, primarily due to their higher operating speeds and their modern features such as rocking firegates, hopper ash pans, and centralized lubrication systems, which cut down on the turnaround time between duties. Over the next 6 years, no fewer than 251 examples of this capable engine were constructed, but as with many large classes, there were a considerable number of upgrades, these including alterations to the ashpan doors, a revised steam brake, modifications to the regulator, changes to the return crank fixings, improved cutouts to assist with maintenance, and other detail variations. Some locomotives were built with non-standard features, in particular engines 92020 to 92029, which were built with the Franco-Crosti boiler, incorporating a preheater, and were easily identifiable by having a side chimney and no smoke deflectors. The Crosti-boilered 9Fs came about due to the demands on the British Railways Board by the UK government to reduce the railway's coal consumption by 10,000 tonnes a week, despite the fact that the country was producing a surplus, with Riddles and his engineering team re-examining the class to see if even more efficiencies could be built into existing designs, with particular focus being on preheating the water before it was admitted to the boiler. There had been many attempts to achieve this, in particular by Douglas Earl Marsh of the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway prior to World War I, and latterly by the experimental use of ACFI feedwater equipment by the London Midland and Scottish and London and North Eastern Railways, while more notable was the famous LNER Class P2 Premier 2001 Cock of the North, which was built with the ACFI equipment, though all of these experiments failed to garner widespread success due to maintenance costs outweighing fuel savings. In Italy, Dr. Piero Crosti and his colleague Attilio Franco had been working on the same problem, proposing a more radical solution than that used by companies such as ACFI, wherein their design waste heat from exhaust gas was used to warm boiler water by being directed into a preheater, which took the form of a secondary boiler. The preheater boiler did not turn the water into steam, but raised its temperature substantially so that when it reached the main boiler, it needed less energy to convert into steam, the first locomotive to be fitted with this system being a large articulated engine in Belgium in 1932, which was followed by others in Italy before the Second World War and Ireland and West Germany after the conflict was over. By the time the BR9Fs were in production, 130 locomotives had been fitted with the Franco-Crosti equipment in mainland Europe, and many were reported to be showing a 20% improvement in efficiency, with some of them being examined by E.S. Cox, who was on the British Transport Commission's design panel when he visited the Italian state railways while on holiday in Venice, a meeting with Dr. Crosti during the same visit leading to an agreement being reached to equip a number of new BR standards with Franco-Crosti equipment, on the proviso that no royalties would be paid until the locomotives exhibited a saving of 12%, with a full payment to become due when the savings reached 18%. A scheme to equip 10 9Fs was then drawn up, but the restrictive loading gauge of the British railway network meant it was impossible to utilise the common Crosti design of having two preheater boilers either side of the main boiler, and thus it was decided that the secondary equipment would have to be fitted underneath the main boiler and between the frames. Even with this compromise, the designers had great difficulty in making room, and it was found necessary to reduce the size of the boiler slightly when compared to the conventional 9Fs to accommodate all that was required, with a single preheat boiler also being used instead of the more usual two. In these locomotives, the exhaust steam from the cylinders was not directed up the chimney in the normal manner, but instead was channeled via a long series of pipes to a blast chamber at the rear right-hand side of the engine, the hot gases from the boiler then being pulled through the preheating boiler after passing through the normal smoke box and, after heating the water, were expelled through a multiple blast pipe chimney which was fitted to the right-hand side of the boiler, about halfway down the engine and not far in front of the fireman's cab window. The conventional boiler was fitted with what looked like a normal chimney, but this was not used except for when lighting the locomotive from cold, and was blanked off during normal running, difficulties during construction leading to delays in the delivery of the Crosties, which eventually began to appear from the crew works in November 1954, with a series of tests being organised at Rugby, which indicated that the Crosti-boilered engines were little better than their conventional counterparts. This came as a bitter blow to Dr. Crosti, who at first had great difficulty in accepting the results, so much so that he gained permission for the great locomotive engineer André Chapelon to examine them for accuracy, though due to a miscommunication between the parties, based on the initial negotiations being conducted in French, which was the native language of neither participant, Crosti had meant to imply that savings of 20% were possible when a Crosti boiler was used in conjunction with feed water heating or exhaust steam injectors, when compared to a locomotive not fitted with any of these. What had been overlooked was that the 9Fs all had exhaust steam injectors as standard, and that this would eliminate some of the advantages of the Crosti system, though regardless, Crosti returned to Italy in disappointment, having received no royalties for the use of his design on the 9Fs, while the 10 locomotives that had been completed as intended were all allocated to the London Midland region for use at Wellingborough Shed, where they were disliked by fitters and train crew alike. One of the biggest issues was the position of the chimney, which tended to spew smoke around the cab area, making conditions on the footplate very uncomfortable, while they also proved to be much more difficult to steam, and there were issues with having to clean the additional tubes in the preheater boiler. Within a short space of time, the engines were back at Crewe, where changes were made to the drafting to try and produce a sharper blast, a form of smoke deflector also being fitted, though this was added to the blast pipes at the side and not in the usual place. But further problems soon emerged regarding corrosion in the preheater boiler due to the formation of acid, and it was also found that far from being more economical than the standard engines, the Crosties were actually burning more coal than their sisters. By 1959, most of the class were in store, and a steam was put in motion to convert them to a more normal configuration, with the preheat boiler being removed from locomotive 92026 in 1959, while the last to be done was 92022 in June 1962, this unit having spent 3 years in store, the conversions retaining the smaller boilers, but the blast was now exhausted up the chimney in the normal place, though smoke deflectors were never fitted as part of this overhaul. Once converted, the Crosties went on to have unremarkable careers, as due to their smaller boilers, they were less powerful than a normal 9F, and were thus downgraded to the title of 8F, while engine crews continued to bemoan their lack of performance, all 10 examples remaining in service until 1966, when 92028 was taken out of traffic, followed by the other 9 units prior to November 1967, with the oldest being only 13 years old and having been in store for part of that time. Beyond the Crosties, locomotives 92165 to 167 were built with a mechanical stoker, while 92250 was equipped with a Giesler ejector chimney, and in September 1957, 92178 was turned out from new with a double chimney, this device saving fuel and increasing power, thus seeing every new unit in the production line from 92183 onwards, together with 92165 to 167, receive this feature, while a number of Western Region allocated engines were also retrofitted with a double chimney. 5 different variations of the BR standard tender were fitted, differing in coal and water capacity as operational requirements dictated, though all locomotives were outshopped in unlined black, with the exception of the final locomotive completed, 92220 Evening Star, this engine receiving a lined passenger green and was specially fitted with a copper-capped chimney in true Great Western style, being the last mainline steam locomotive to be built for British Railways in 1960. In time, the 9Fs came to be well regarded, and had an extensive sphere of operation, the class being successfully used on block tanker trains from Fawley Refinery on the southern region, on steel trains to and from Ebbw Vale Steelworks in Wales, on heavy freight trains to and from Glasgow, iron ore trains from Tyne Dock to Concert, coal trains from the major producing areas, and also anhydrite trains along the punishing Settle and Carlisle line. As for their reputation among crews, the 9Fs were considered free-running, comfortable to drive and fire, and to be masters of any work that was put before them, while those in the sheds found them reliable and easy to maintain, the free-running characteristics of the class soon seeing them put to other uses, including employment on weekend additional passenger trains and excursions during times when freight traffic was quieter. By this time, it had been realized that the 9Fs could be run at over 50 miles an hour without any difficulty, and the class was subsequently recorded working excursions to Bangor, Bristol, Blackpool and more, while during times of desperation, Shedmasters had no hesitation of putting a 9F out on a regular passenger diagram or as a substitute for a failed engine, the result being that examples turned up on expresses such as the Red Dragon on the Western region and occasionally on crack expresses on the East Coast Main Line, with one example reported to have reached 90 miles an hour in regular service. The class would achieve a great deal of fame working on the late lamented Somerset and Dorset Railway, with trials starting on that route in the middle of 1960, during which 92240 crossed the hills in rainy conditions with a load of 10 bogies, resulting in 4 of the class being permanently allocated to the line for the summer, with others following in subsequent years. The famous 92220 Evening Star also had the honour of hauling the final Pines Express over the route in 1964, though the 9Fs may have worked longer on the Somerset and Dorset had they been fitted with steam heating, this being simply an outcome of the fact that they had been purpose-built as freight engines with no routine passenger duties in mind when they were designed. Unfortunately, the 9Fs entered construction very late in the steam era for British Railways, as only 1 year after their assembly run began, the 1955 modernisation plan was announced that sought to replace mainline steam traction in the UK with diesels and electrics by the end of the next decade, despite the fact that the 9Fs had been designed to accommodate working lives of up to 30 years based on a gradual removal of steam traction, with the set expiry date of these machines being either the late 1980s or early 1990s. Instead, withdrawal started long before the engines were worn out, with the first examples being taken out of service only 4 years after the last units had been completed, with 92170, 92171, 92175, 92176 and 92177 being withdrawn from the eastern region during 1964, batch withdrawals subsequently taking place year on year as the end of steam in mainline use drew ever closer, with the final 18 being retired in 1968, many of which were less than 10 years old, and thus represented a significant waste in consideration of their construction cost and superb performance. With the class having such a widespread operational area, 23 private scrapyards would become involved in disposing of the class, with Drapers of Hull tackling the most significant number at 38, while 6 of the others took only 1 each, though fortunately for preservationists, several went to the famous Woodham's scrapyard in Barry, South Wales, from where they were rescued, while others were bought directly from British Railways in working order. In total, 9 examples escaped the cutter's torch, though only 5 of these have ever steamed in private ownership, with 92203, now named Black Prince, being bought by railway artist David Shepherd and has since become a resident of the North Norfolk Railway, where boiler repairs have recently been completed. 92212 is located at the Mid-Hants Railway, 92214 at the Great Central, and final class member 92220 is on display at the National Railway Museum, though this too had previously steamed on both heritage railways and the main line, while 92240, 92134, 92209, 92219, and 92245 are all stored in various levels of condition. Unfortunately, the 9F, as a machine that is too large for most heritage railways, and due to its 210 flangeless wheel arrangement, cannot be certified for mainline operation, thus meaning that the potential future for the survivors is somewhat uncertain. Nevertheless, despite the working lives of the 9Fs being very short, these engines illustrated perhaps one of the most outstanding steam locomotive designs ever to run on the UK railway network, and had the decision not been made to replace steam with diesel and electric traction at such an immediate pace, these engines could have had the potential to see continued use up to and as late as the 1980s or 1990s. In the end, while their careers were tragically cut short after a maximum of between 6 and 10 years, the tremendous power, ease of maintenance, and high-speed capabilities of these unassuming freight locomotives make the 9Fs a superb piece of British railway design, and quite possibly the greatest steam locomotive ever to run on UK metals.